Look closely at the aircraft you're seeing on the screen. A matte black object without any major visible markings with a robust build. Angled shape, almost triangular. It looks simple, it looks like a cheap prototype, almost harmless. But what you're seeing is one of the most devastating weapons built in this war, and it had been attacking Russian territory in absolute silence for 3 years. Now look at this other man. His name is Sergei Shoigu. Today, he is the Secretary of the Russian Security Council, one of the highest positions in the Russian government. But what matters for you to know about him is what he was before. Until 2 years ago, Sergei Shoigu was Russia's Minister of Defense for 12 consecutive years. He was the one who oversaw the invasion of Ukraine in 2001, and he was the one who authorized the systematic bombings against Ukrainian power plants during each winter of the war. It is this same man who today has an arrest warrant issued by the International Criminal Court for war crimes. And it is this man who is, at this moment, publicly saying something that 5 years ago would have been unthinkable.
Está acusando países.
NATO, specifically Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, of being open accomplices in the aggression against Russia, by allowing Ukrainian drones to pass through their airspace to attack Russian territory. He said that recently. And he said it because he can no longer explain in any other way what's happening inside Russia. Refineries catching fire 1,500 kilometers from the border. Oil exports dropping 43% in a single week. $1 billion in revenue lost in 7 days. And the Russian air defense, one of the most expensive and complex on the planet, simply isn't able to stop what's coming from the sky. But Shoigu is wrong. It's not NATO that's doing this, and the truth when you find out will be much more uncomfortable for the Kremlin.
Do que qualquer teoria.
Because what is destroying Russia from within was built entirely on Ukrainian territory, in silence, while the world looked the other way. This week, Ukraine did something strange. It invited foreign diplomats to a private room in its capital and showed them a weapon that no one knew existed. They put a sign next to it, removed the cover, and only then, after 3 years, admitted that this weapon had already been attacking Russia since 2023. 3 years in combat. 3 years in absolute silence. 3 years of silence, hundreds of missions. Maybe thousands, with no country in the world, not even the target, knowing what it was. Today you will understand what this weapon is, why Ukraine kept it hidden for so long, and why they are revealing it now. It might be the most calculated strategic move that Ukraine has made in this war. Let's return to the room where it was all revealed. On April 14th, 2026, in a room inside the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, diplomats from dozens of countries were invited to walk among weapons manufactured by the Ukrainian defense industry. There were long-range missiles, naval drones, and systems to intercept Shaheds, the Iranian drones most used by Russia. There was even electronic warfare equipment. And in the middle of that corridor of weapons, on a simple stand, was that aircraft you saw at the beginning of the video with a small plaque next to it. Her name was Sishen in Ukrainian, which means January. The specifications that were on the small plaque next to it left the diplomats speechless. A range of 1,400 kilometers, accuracy of 20 meters on target, a modular warhead of 40 kilos, meaning it can be swapped depending on the mission. Look, a speed of 200 kilometers per hour, a maximum altitude of 1,500 meters, launch preparation time less than 15 minutes. And perhaps the most important detail, the drone is designed to operate in active electronic warfare environments, which means it keeps flying and hitting targets even when the enemy is trying to jam navigation signals. And to give you an idea of what that range means, 1,400 kilometers is more than the distance of a full day's drive on the road. Imagine a weapon leaving a city, traveling for hours over enemy territory, and hitting a target the size of a small house in another country. And doing this from a pickup truck with less than 15 minutes of preparation and resisting attempts to jam the signal. This is Sishen, and this is just the beginning of the story. There's one detail. On all the plates next to the weapons, the name of the manufacturing company was written. There was only one where it wasn't exactly. The one for Sishen. 3 years after the weapon was used in combat, Ukraine still hasn't disclosed which company makes it, how much each unit costs, or how many have been built. This silence is deliberate. It's protection against sanctions that could affect the supply chain. And it's protection against the enemy itself, who knows that if they find out where the factory is, they might try to destroy it with missiles. But technical specifications are only half the story. The other half is in the name. Because the name is almost a declaration of war in itself. January in Ukraine is not just a month. Since the beginning of the invasion, January has become the month when Russia intensifies its bombings the most. And these are not bombings against soldiers. They are bombings against power plants, heating stations, electrical grids, hospitals. The goal is simple and brutal: to cut off heating in the middle of winter and make civilians freeze to death inside their own homes. Women, the elderly, children. It's a deliberate strategy to kill by hypothermia. January in Ukraine is the month of suffering. Therefore, when Ukrainian engineers finished developing a weapon capable of flying 1,400 kilometers into Russia, they didn't just pick any name. They named it January. It wasn't a coincidence. It was language. It was a cultural message, engraved into the weapon's identification code. Every time a Sishen leaves a Ukrainian launcher and enters Russian airspace, it carries in its very name the meaning of revenge for the civilians Russia froze to death. Now that you understand the name comes the most disturbing question of all. What exactly did this weapon do during the 3 years it remained hidden? The answer? Well, it started to appear in the last few weeks. Just in the month of March 2026, Ukraine launched more than 7,000 long-range drones against Russian territory. Some of them traveled more than 1,500 kilometers inside Russia before hitting their targets. And this is where the story starts to get absurd. For the first time in the entire war, Ukraine launched more long-range drones against Russia than Russia launched against Ukraine. Stop and think about that. The country, invaded, bombed daily, with cities destroyed and millions of refugees, is launching more explosives farther than the third largest military power in the world. This isn't just about a weapon, this is about a historic reversal, and the damage showed up in the economic numbers. Refineries were hit in Kostov, in Saratov, in Ust-Luga, in Primorsk, in Novorossiysk. Critical points of the Russian oil export system. Russia's refining capacity has dropped by 17%, which is equivalent to more than 1 million barrels per day that are no longer being processed. Oil exports, which are the main driver of the Russian war economy, fell by 43% in a single week. The loss of revenue in 7 days exceeded $1 billion. And in mid-March, something happened that for the Kremlin is almost a public surrender. Sergei Shoigu himself, the same man who signed the invasion orders for Ukraine in 2022, the same man who authorized the winter bombing campaigns that gave the drone its name, admitted out loud something that would have been unthinkable before. He said that no region of Russia is immune to Ukrainian attacks. Pay attention to this irony. The man behind the January bombings was admitting that he could no longer stop a weapon called January. But the confession didn't stop there. Half of Russia's Pantsir systems, those air defense cannons that each cost more than $15 million, have already been destroyed by Ukrainian operations. Russia is literally running out of the means to defend its own territory. And a retired Russian general, now a deputy, named Andrei Gurulyov, summed up the situation in a sentence that the Kremlin certainly wishes had not been said. Russia is just too massive. The forces are stretched too thin. There's no way to create a continuous protective shield. In other words, what he's saying is that the country is too big to defend. And Sishen was one of the silent weapons behind all of this. And then comes the question that may have crossed your mind. If it worked so well in silence, why reveal it now? The answer? It's that revealing Sishen now wasn't about vanity. It was a calculated move with 3 different recipients, designed to send 3 messages at the same time. The first message was for Europe. Exactly 1 day after Sishen appeared in public, Ukraine signed a €4 billion defense agreement with Germany in Berlin. $3.2 billion for Patriot missiles and air defense launchers. Joint production of 5,000 medium-range drones with artificial intelligence. And perhaps the most important point for our story, €300 million specifically allocated for Ukrainian deep strike capabilities. In other words, weapons capable of hitting targets far from the front line, deep in the heart of enemy territory. Exactly the category in which Sishen is included. Showing a drone with 3 years of proven combat experience 1 day before closing a contract of this magnitude is showing that the product is mature, not in the testing stage. It's a showcase made for investors, not for tourists. The second message was for Moscow. And this might be the most disturbing one. Stop and think. If Sishen stayed hidden for 3 years while attacking Russian territory, how many other weapons are still hidden in the Ukrainian arsenal? Russia now has to assume with every interception that the incoming drone could be anything. This forces defensive planning to assume the worst-case scenario. Every decision, every expense, every system has to take into account threats that Russian intelligence can't even name. And the third message was for Washington. While the United States is draining its stockpiles of Patriot missiles to the Middle East because of the conflict with Iran, Ukraine is sending a silent message. We are not waiting. We are becoming self-sufficient. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha stated that 95% of long-range attacks today are carried out with Ukrainian-made weapons. More than 400,000 people work in the country's defense sector. More than half of the weapons used on the front line are produced within Ukraine itself. For the White House, the message is clear. If you can't continue, we will. 3 messages, 3 recipients, a single showcase, and each one of them stands on its own. Millions of dollars in geopolitical value. Rarely in history has a small country done so much with so little. Now, we've reached what might be the most important point in this whole story. Because the Sishen, as impressive as it is nowhere near the most powerful weapon in the Ukrainian arsenal. It is a piece, a cog in the ecosystem that the world is still trying to understand. There is, for example, a weapon called Flamingo. It is a Ukrainian ground-launched long-range missile with a range of 3,000 kilometers. It doubles the range of the Sishen. And its warhead weighs over 1,000 kilos. In other words, it carries 25 times more explosives than the Sishen carries. There's also the Lyuti, a drone that crashes into its target with a range of 2,000 kilometers, and it's already been responsible for attacks on Russian cities as far away as Kazan and Samara. There's the FP1, which is made with 90% of its components manufactured inside Ukraine. In other words, almost nothing depends on imports. There are Morok, Bars, Obry, Huta, and Neptune. A whole family of weapons, each with a different profile. Each one filling a specific part of the threat map. And all of this was built in 3 years in a country with cities being bombed every day, with power plants being destroyed. with millions of refugees, with the economy broken, with soldiers dying on the front lines. In 3 years, a country in total war industrialized one of the most diverse deep strike arsenals in the world. And Sishen was just a hidden part of all that. And there's a brutal irony in all of this. At the beginning of the invasion in 2022, Russian intelligence calculated that Ukraine would fall in 3 days. Instead, the Neo-Kremlin ended up giving Ukraine exactly what it needed to build all of this: time, motivation, access to Western technology, and an existential reason to never depend on anyone again. Meanwhile, in industrial warehouses scattered across Ukraine at undisclosed addresses, engineers whose names no one will hear. They designed the Sishen in silence, designing modular warheads, piston engines, navigation systems resistant to electronic warfare, while the country itself was being bombed at night. Putin didn't lose the war for lack of an army. He lost the strategic advantage because of a miscalculation about how long a people can endure fighting. And that's what leads us to the conclusion that you may not have realized yet. Take a deep breath, because what comes next changes how we understand this entire war. 3 years ago, if someone had told an American, Russian, French, or Chinese general that it was possible, a medium-sized country under constant bombardment, without superpower infrastructure, secretly building a complete deep strike program with multiple weapons operating for years without the enemy knowing, that general would have laughed. He would have said that it was impossible, that it required decades, huge budgets, protected laboratories, complex supply chains, that it was the kind of thing the United States, Russia, and China do, not for an invaded country. Ukraine has just proven that they were all wrong, and this changes the playbook for war in the next decade. Because if Ukraine managed to do this, any medium-sized country with the right doctrine, political will, local engineering, and support can now, in theory, do the same thing. And here the story comes full circle in a way that not even the best screenwriter could write. Because there is a tragic symmetry in the fact that it is precisely Sergei Shoigu who today makes these statements in public. The man who commanded the Russian army for 12 years. The man who in 2022 promised to take the Ukrainian capital in 3 days. The man who ordered every winter campaign against the Ukrainian power plants. It's him today, almost venting, accusing 4 NATO countries of being complicit in the aggression against Russia. The architect of the invasion has become the spokesperson for impotence. The man who caused the winters has become the man who complains about a weapon called January. Maybe there's no clearer image of how this whole war has changed than this one. For Russia, the consequence is brutal. For 70 years since the beginning of the Cold War, there was something called the monopoly of fear. The strategic threat radiated outward from Moscow. It was the Russians who threatened their neighbors, never the other way around. Now, for the first time in generations, the strategic threat is coming from a smaller, poorer neighbor. It comes as a refinery in flames. It comes as a drop in exports. It comes in the form of a swarm. It comes in the form of a weapon named after a winter month. It comes every day. And it comes in silence. If this video helped you understand what's happening in this war in a way that regular news doesn't tell you, do something simple for me. Share it with someone who also likes to really understand geopolitics, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. We have a lot more stories to tell. See you next time!